What's up, everybody? So late last week, Aggrend responded to a few questions on Twitter asking about how they value utility when balancing classes. And he also mentioned Shadow Priest specifically. So I wanted to talk about what he said. I wanted to give my own thoughts on it. And I wanted to talk about how we can still balance Shadow Priest, even given the constraints that they've laid out in their post. So I'm going to summarize Aggrend's tweets, but if you want to read them for yourself, they are linked in the video description below. So he said a few things. Number one is that they do take utility into account when balancing classes. Sure, I think that makes sense. You know, if a class has a lot of utility, nerf its damage. Sure, fine. We already know that's the case with Shadow Priest, so let it continue happening. Just make sure that it happens to other classes, namely shamans, because they've gotten away with having a lot of utility and a lot of damage for a little bit too long. Next up, he said that they really like the Swiss Army knife approach that they have for Shadow Priest, where Shadow Priest just has a ton of utility, and they like that it can be really beneficial to your group to have one. Now, I don't mind being a Swiss Army knife. If anything, I really enjoy it because I'm someone who likes to provide additional value to my group outside of my damage. But there's a problem with this analogy. If you're somebody who is using a Swiss Army knife, you get to pick and choose the tool that you want to use given the situation that you're in. But with Shadow, there is no choice. You are forced to use the utility because there is no alternative. There is nothing you can choose to substitute instead of that utility. I'm sure it was a poor choice of words, but there needs to be some choice for the utility the Shadow Priest provides. Having no choice makes me feel less like a Swiss Army knife and more like a robot being told to pass the butter.
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
Yeah, welcome to the club, pal.
And finally, someone asked him about a rune that I suggested where it would take away healing from Vampiric Embrace, but increase the damage of the Shadow Priest. And essentially, Aggrend said that he does not like this idea because it creates this weird dichotomy between the people who use the rune and people who don't. The people who use the rune are probably in better guilds that don't need the healing utility that comes from Vampiric Embrace, so they can pump a lot easier and just do higher damage. Whereas the people who are in lesser skilled groups need the utility to help their group. So even though they might be at the same skill level as the player in that higher skilled group, their damage is not going to reflect that. Now I understand Aggrend's argument here, but my counter is this. People sacrifice their damage all the time for the benefit of the group. As someone who's been an officer in guilds, I make callouts for other people. I've done jobs that other people don't want to do. This takes away from my damage, but helps the group. I choose to sacrifice my damage to help the group. Playing Shadow does not give you this choice. You are forced to be the team player. And that leads me into another point about utility. Pretty much every class has utility now. Warriors are getting a smaller version of a world buff. Shamans have a ton of totems, Mark of the Alpha, just a ton of utility to provide. Rogues are getting occult poison on top of already having improved exposed armor. Hunters have their version of Kings, Ferals have their version of Wind Fury. So there's a lot of utility going around. It's not just Shadow Priests that have utility, but I would say Shadow probably brings the most amount of utility, is the most beneficial to a wide variety of classes in the group. But there's one main difference between the utility that other classes provide and the utility that Shadow Priests provide. The utility that other classes provide is not tied to the amount of damage they do. The more damage a Shadow Priest does, the more healing they do and the more mana they return to their group. It's not like if a warrior does higher DPS, then they give more attack power to people in their group. It's not like if a shaman does higher DPS, then Wind Fury is going to have a higher proc rate on their party members. It doesn't work that way for any class except for Shadow Priest, and that is what's ultimately holding Shadow Priest back. Now this leads me into my next point that Shadow Priest is the one class that pays the utility tax. We are the one class whose damage is lowered because of our utility, and I'm going to prove that in this next part. The reason this is true is because our utility is tied directly to our damage. The strength of Vampiric Embrace and Vampiric Touch comes from how much damage we do. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to talk about the fight Avatar of Hakar, and I'm going to be using my own logs. My logs are pretty good for a Shadow Priest, but when you compare them to other classes, they don't hold up that well. I like this fight because it has a decent amount of AoE damage and the tank is constantly getting hit, which means my healing from Vampiric Embrace is extremely relevant. But imagine if I was doing the same amount of damage as a 99 percentile Parsing Enhancement Shaman. What would my healing look like then? Now, the reason I want to talk about this specifically is because Aggrend did say that if these classes that bring a bunch of utility happen to find their ways to the top of the meters, they would be pretty reluctant to nerf them. And I have to call bullshit on that for Shadow Priest because I think Shadow Priest would be way too strong of a class if its damage was ever as high as Enhancement Shamans has been relative to the rest of the DPS in a phase. So back to Avatar of Hakar. On this fight, I parsed a 99, which was 933 DPS, but I also did around 1250 HPS, which is healing per second. Now that's pretty good healing for a class that doesn't actually hit any healing spells. I just make sure the target that I'm damaging has Vampiric Embrace on it. So this ends up being about 250 HPS per person in my group. And this healing is about 30% higher than my DPS for the fight. Now, if I look at 99th percentile for Enhancement Shamans on this fight, that's around 1750 DPS. So if I was doing 1750 DPS on this fight, multiply it by 30%, that ends up being 2,275 raw HPS that a Shadow Priest would be doing on Avatar of Hakar. That's almost double the amount of healing that I'm already doing in this fight. It's basically adding another 1,000 raw HPS to it. So now when you divide that by 5, that means that 455 HPS is what I would be doing to each person in my group if I was doing the same amount of DPS as a 99th percentile Parsing Enhancement Shaman. Now, why would it be a problem a Shadow Priest doing that much healing? Well, when I look at this same log and I look at our tank, the amount of healing required to keep our tank at full HP was only 270 HPS. That doesn't mean he was only getting 270 HPS. Our healers were definitely overhealing, but it does show that it's actually a very little amount that our tank needs in order to stay healthy. But when I include overhealing, that goes up to 850 raw HPS that was being done to our tank in this fight. So if you wanted Shadow Priest specifically to be able to hit that 850 raw HPS that was being done to our tank, because let's just say that's what we needed to keep him alive, with current Shadow Priest damage, you would need 4 Shadow Priests in the tank group in order to heal that. Now it's possible, but it's pretty unreasonable for most groups to try to do that. But if you assume that the Shadow Priest is doing the same amount of damage as a 99 Parsing Enhancement Shaman, you only need 2 Shadow Priests in the tank group. And what else is that you only need 1 Shadow Priest dispersed throughout each of the other 3 groups, which means altogether, you only need 5 Shadow Priests to heal this fight, and you don't need any healers. That is the strength of Vampiric Embrace, and that is why Shadow Priest will never be a top tier damage dealer in Season of Discovery, unless we change the core functionality of Vampiric Embrace and Vampiric Touch to not be dependent upon the Shadow Priest damage. And this all goes to show why I think that if Shadow Priest ever did reach the levels of damage that an Enhancement Shaman is doing relative to the rest of the DPS, so I mean, we are way above everybody except maybe Warriors, they would be nerfed immediately. This is way too much healing and probably way too much mana to return to everybody in your group, and that is a huge problem. That is why Shadow will never really be a good DPS ever, because they're being held back by these mechanics that are directly tied to the amount of damage they're doing. If we can decouple the power of these spells from the damage the Shadow Priest does, it does 2 things. One, it allows Blizzard to tune the healing and mana return of these 2 spells so much easier than just nerfing the damage of the Shadow Priest. And 2, it allows them to give scaling to the Shadow Priest, which Shadow has never really had in Classic. Shadow has always scaled extremely poorly compared to other classes. So by decoupling the power of Vampiric Embrace and Vampiric Touch from the amount of damage the Shadow Priest does, Blizzard can introduce additional scaling mechanisms for Shadow Priest so that as they scale, they don't need to worry about their utility becoming overpowered, because scaling is a huge issue for Shadow. So I've talked a lot about the problem, but how can we actually fix this? What can be done so that these 2 spells don't just get crazy overpowered if the Shadow Priest for some reason does a lot of damage, which again, I'm not advocating for. The first thing that I can think of in order to fix these abilities is to turn them into a form of replenishment that exists in Wrath of the Lich King or Cataclysm. The way replenishment works is it restores 1% of maximum mana every few seconds for 15 seconds after the Shadow Priest casts Mind Blast on a target with Vampiric Touch on it. If this type of mechanic is introduced for Vampiric Touch and Vampiric Embrace so that it's just a percent of total mana and health that gets restored, it's no longer tied to the power, to the damage that the Shadow Priest is doing. This is a really smart solution, I think. Now, what problems does this create? Well, if it's based off the mana pool of the person who's it's getting restored to, or based off the HP pool, then people with larger mana pools, people with larger HP pools are going to benefit from this more. If you wanted to make it a flat amount, you could tie it to the stats of the priests themselves. Now, the first way this could work is if you tie the power of Vampiric Embrace and Vampiric Touch to the Shadow Priest's intellect. Mostly, not always, but mostly, stronger gear has more intellect on it. This is an intriguing solution because Shadow never really cared about intellect. Their best gear has always been insert item name here of Shadow Wrath. By giving Shadow Priest some form of scaling with intellect, even if it's not damage, even if it's just health or mana return, it makes that stat more valuable and could make gearing more fun along the way as well. Another solution is to tie the mana return and health return of these spells to the Shadow Priest spell power. Note that their utility will still become stronger as the priest becomes stronger, but this tuning can be adjusted so that it's not as oppressively strong as it is right now. For instance, let's say that the Shadow Priest restores 10% of their spell power per second as health to their party member. A gain of 100 spell power increases the amount of healing received by party members by 10 healing per second. But that same 100 spell power gives the Shadow Priest about 85 DPS. That 85 DPS translates to 25 healing per second to every single party member. This makes Vampiric Embrace 40% as effective as it was before. And it also allows for further scaling of the Shadow Priest, because if the Shadow Priest gains a lot of crit, that might increase the damage of the Shadow Priest, but it does not increase the healing received by the Shadow Priest's party members. Or if Shadow were to get some really fun, strong new spell, that spell might increase the damage of the Shadow Priest, but does not increase the amount of mana and health they return. Now, the tuning of these spells can be that they do the same amount of HPS and MP5 that they do right now. That doesn't need to change, but the fact is that as the Shadow Priest's damage increases, the power of these is also not increasing. It's just tied to the stats of the priest or to the max HP or max MP of the people in their party. It's not tied to the damage output of the priest. This means that the Season of Discovery team could implement scaling to Shadow Priests so that they can be a real DPS, a competitive DPS option, without their utility going haywire. So what if improved VE then got changed to say that it increases the damage of your periodic shadow spells on targets afflicted by Vampiric Embrace by 10% of your total intellect? This does a few things for Shadow Priests. 1, gives Shadow Priests scaling from white stats, which they didn't have before. 2, allows Shadow to epitomize the idea of being a dot class. By strengthening our dots through our intellect, this gives us not only a scaling option, but also adds to the thematic flair of being a Shadow Priest. And 3, since the VE and VT mechanics are now changed, this scaling does not increase the amount of mana and health that is going to be returned by the priest. It is a scaling option that does not affect our utility. And it makes gearing a lot more interesting than just trying to find the item with the most amount of shadow spell power on it. Altogether, these changes still allow Shadow Priest to be a Swiss Army knife of utility, but they also allow it to become somewhat close to a real DPS class, because not everybody who plays Shadow wants to be a full utility bot all of the time. Damage is in itself some form of utility. The faster things die, the less mechanics you have to deal with. And this also solves future scaling problems that are going to happen with Vampiric Embrace and Vampiric Touch. If VE remains in its current state, then the only future for Shadow Priest in Season of Discovery is to be what Shadow Priest was in the Burning Crusade, which is so far at the bottom of the meters that you're not considered a real DPS class anyway. Let me know your thoughts, and if you agree or disagree with anything that I've said here, I'd love to hear your opinions, and hopefully we can give some more ideas to the Season of Discovery dev team. Anyway, my name's Pantspace, and I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, look, another version of WoW Classic. I wonder if Shadow PV will now be sick. Don't wanna walk around the same path and get myself in green shit of Shadow Wrath. They said it's called Season of Discovery. Maybe they fix our classic problems here for me. The sunken temple raid looks so fun, keep progressing. Even the elite isn't done. Our utility will be neat, I'm sure. We will be useful once for four. Oh, look, another version of WoW Classic. I wonder if Shadow PV will now be sick. Don't wanna walk around the same path and get myself in green shit of Shadow Wrath. Oh god, they nerfed the dungeon 1, 2, 3 times for dance to clear it with a breeze. What about a DPS? Let me take a look, see if Warcraft logs for us is any good. I can't wait to compare my 99 and just to see if I did fine. Oh, look, another version of WoW Classic. I wonder if Shadow PV will now be sick. Don't wanna walk around the same path and get myself in green shit of Shadow Wrath. Oh, look, another version of WoW Classic. I wonder if Shadow PV will now be sick. Don't wanna walk around the same path and get myself in green shit of Shadow Wrath. Scrolling through the logs is when I see I fall heartbroken on my knee. My mouth stands open wide with shock. We really hit the bottom rock. What's the reason for this mess? Our skin still sucks, let me guess.